So my name is Patrick Heller. I'm a professor of sociology and international affairs at Brown University in the United States, and I'm here at Los Andes to give some talks. And the talk I gave this morning was entitled The Age of Reaction. And as a scholar, as a sociologist who's long been interested in democratization in the global South, this is a period of great concern. We've seen across the world the rise of right-wing ethno-nationalist movements, and in particular the literature is focused a lot on the rise of Trump in the United States and of anti-immigrant parties in Europe. But we've also seen a similar phenomenon in some of the global South, and in particular the two cases that I'm interested in looking at more closely and comparing, namely India and Brazil. So last year, Jair Bolsonaro was elected as president of Brazil. It was a bit of a dramatic and surprise outcome. He is, in every sense of the term, a right-wing populist with some very strong authoritarian trends. And this is quite alarming in a country that over the last 30 years had made so much progress in terms of consolidating and deepening its democracy. And similarly, Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, has been re-elected for a second term just recently in May at the head of the BJP party. And the BJP party is a party that primarily has been pushing for a redefinition of the Indian nation as a Hindu nation, what's known as Hindutva in India. And also has some fairly pronounced authoritarian tendencies. And so the big interesting comparative question is, why now, and why do these reactions, that is the rise of these right-wing populist ethno-nationalist politicians, how can we explain this across two countries that otherwise seem to be so different? So I think in both cases what we have are elite reactions by the dominant groups in Brazil and South Africa, namely the upper classes, but also big chunks of the middle class, to what is best described as a democratic upsurge over the last 2 decades. So in the case of India, beginning in the 80s, middle class groups started mobilizing on their own terms. They started challenging the dominance of traditional political parties, which were heavily dominated by upper caste groups, and eventually this led to two consecutive 5-year governments in India called the UPA, the United Progressive Alliance, led by the Indian Congress Party, pushing an agenda of beginning to build a welfare state and explicitly using the language of social rights in doing so. Similarly, in Brazil, after the military regime of '85, there's a series of presidents, but finally it all sort of consolidates around Lula coming to power at the head of the PT, the Workers' Party, and essentially pushing a project of also expanding social rights and expanding the role of the welfare state in reducing poverty and providing services and generally uplifting the popular sectors. And that in both cases, this really eventually reached a point where it presented a significant threat to the traditional economic position, but also the traditional social privileges and status of elite groups, that at a moment of crisis and at these moments of political elections, produced coalitions that are coalitions essentially of reaction. And these are coalitions that have rallied around a defense of the middle class and of excluding the popular sectors from social benefits. And there are trends in these new populist regimes that are directly challenging democratic institutions, and in particular challenging the very strong role that civil society has played in the last 20, 30 years in strengthening democracy. So there's cause for great concern, but hopefully through some careful comparisons we can learn some lessons and bring light to bear on this complex set of questions. So one of the things that we see across all these cases of right-wing populism is an upsurge in violence. And the violence is really working at both ends. So on the one hand, support for these regimes has often been triggered by either real instances or the perception of an increasingly insecure environment. So in Europe and the United States, concerns about terrorism, concern about increasing crime rates has fed into a right-wing rhetoric of the need for greater security. But in the cases that I'm interested in, India and Brazil, this has been a very distinct pattern. In Brazil, crime rates have been up in general, especially in cities. And in India, the BJP, which is the party in power, currently in power, itself has played a role in instigating forms of communal violence, that is, violence between the Muslim, minority Muslim community and the majority Hindu community. But they've also really highlighted the dangers of terrorism in ways that are grotesquely exaggerated and seek to almost automatically stigmatize all Muslims as potential terrorists. And this has created clearly an environment of insecurity, especially with respect to the geopolitical problem of Pakistan. And the BJP has capitalized in part on this concern with security to build increasing support, especially amongst the middle class. So the BJP is now in power in India, the Bolsonaro is now in power in Brazil, and the biggest concern is that both these governments have actually been very direct in encouraging various kinds of vigilante groups to take the law into their own hands and to become essentially instruments of state power. In the case of India, this takes the form of some of the organizations associated with the BJP organizing lynch mobs and attacking Muslims, supposedly for eating beef. And this has really spread across the country and created a climate of absolute fear and terror for the large Muslim minority in India. And Bolsonaro, in the name of fighting the banditos and criminality, has given a lot of support to the police and given them new legislative powers, but has also essentially been encouraging paramilitary activity. His own son in Rio is associated with some paramilitary groups. And anytime a so-called democratic government is unleashing extra state forms of coercion in the form of vigilante groups or paramilitary groups, you have to seriously worry about the future of that democracy. In the case of India, in the case of Brazil, as well as in the case of the United States, there's great concern that these right-wing populists have come to power and they have quite strong bases of support and are pushing a style of politics and a set of policies that arguably are antithetical to the norms of democracy, and in particular to the norms of democratic inclusion. Having said that, it's important to remember that their powers are still limited, that they came to power democratically, and they still have to answer to democratic institutions and democratic constitutions, and despite all their efforts to instrumentalize or use or corrupt those institutions in some cases are very, very robust. In the US, they're particularly robust because it's an older democracy. It's also a very federal democracy, and there are many parts of the country that just are not on board with Trump's agenda. In Brazil, I think to some extent, the institutions are also quite strong, but what makes a big difference in Brazil is just the historical strength of civil society. It's a very sophisticated, very well-organized civil society with a lot of horizontal connections. So I think there's a lot of capacity within civil society to resist some of the efforts by Bolsonaro to undermine democratic institutions. It's also not clear to me that Bolsonaro has a real base, that the circumstances under which he won the elections were quite unusual. There'd been a collapse of some of the centrist political parties in Brazil But his style of populism, while it may produce a lot of fervent support among certain groups, it's not really clear he can build a sustainable coalition. So in that respect, there's some room for optimism that this will be a relatively short-run experiment with authoritarianism. India is a far greater concern simply because Narendra Modi and the BJP, unlike Bolsonaro and his recently created political party, the BJP is highly organized, it's highly programmatic, it's deeply ideological. They have a vision, they have a project, they're determined, they have millions of cadres on the ground to push forward their effort. And the electoral victory of the BJP in this past election was really overwhelming. So they do have a massive electoral mandate. So there's a lot of concern there. But it's also the case, not as much so as in Brazil, that there's a pretty ingenious and resilient civil society in India. So it's too early to judge, really. There's great room for concern given the recent actions of the BJP and, among other things, annexing the entire state of Kashmir, the only Muslim majority state in India. But it's a big, huge, diverse, and unwieldy country. And so one has to hope that even a determined authoritarian regime is going to find it very difficult to impose its mandate. So I think one of the defining features of populism is that the populist leader really believes themselves to embody the people, and they really believe that the election in and of itself has given them a 4 or 5 year mandate to pretty much do whatever they want to do, and to pretty much ignore democratic institutions, norms of civility, and civil society. And this is of great concern, obviously. But I think the limit of that is that a lot of civil society is deeply institutionalized, and dismantling it takes a lot of work. We know from the history of authoritarianism that one of the first things authoritarian governments do is attack civil society organizations, first discursively, but then try to legally intimidate them and eventually even just repress them. And one of the civil society institutions, two of the key civil society institutions that all authoritarian regimes tackle or go up against, of course, are the media, insofar as the media is still criticizing the regime, and universities. And the reason they go after universities is that universities are spaces that are relatively autonomous, and that have a mission to think critically, to ask questions, to challenge. And universities often historically have been centers of resistance to authoritarian regimes. And so I think, a key metric of whether or not these new right-wing regimes are being successful in imposing their agenda or not will be the degree to which they're able to control and silence universities. And here I think the sort of global ties and connections are really important. Universities now are all a part of globalized networks of academics and exchanges and students, etc. And I think it's incredibly important that universities, as autonomous spaces of civil society that are dedicated to the proposition of open, engaged, deliberative debate and argument, support each other and call out those regimes that make concerted efforts to threaten the autonomy of the university.